My name is John Galt. I was born in 1779 in Irvine, Scotland, and moved to Greenock with my family when I was 10 years old. Many families moved up the coast from Ayrshire at this time to take advantage of the new harbour, a growing merchant class and close connections with a flourishing Glasgow. My father was a shipmaster and ship owner here, trading with North America, the West Indies and other parts of the British Empire. Greenock was like an El Dorado on the Clyde, and there were great opportunities to make one's fortune. I do not like to boast, but when I was in my prime, I was described as a fine, handsome man, over 6 feet in height, with jet black hair, a straight nose, piercing eyes, and a broad, well-developed frame. In my lifetime, I have travelled the world, made money and lost money. I was the first superintendent of the Canada Company and founded the towns of Guelph and then Goderich, with the Greenockian William Tiger Dunlop, son of Alexander Dunlop of Keppoch, the Greenock magistrate and merchant. Now, I write for a living and have retired to my adopted hometown, Greenock. You may have heard of some of my books: The Annals of the Parish, The Steamboat, The Provost, and a biography of Byron, whom I met several times over the years. I want to give you a short tour of this fine town. We will walk through the harbours and town centre, and I will give you some history of the town and the people who lived here. I am here today, in the year 1833, to visit some old friends and family and get their opinion on the movement to abolish slavery in the West Indies. Where better than the centre of the Scottish West Indian trade, Greenock? I have my own thoughts on this matter, but more of this later. Let me show you the East India Harbour, just recently constructed with a new dry dock. It is just to our east, behind this building. The East India Harbour was built to accommodate new trade after the East India Company lost its monopoly. The first Indiaman fitted out from the Clyde was the ship Earl of Buckingham, weighing 600 tons, in 1816. At that date, Greenock Harbour had accommodation for 500 sail of ship. Many men of this company have settled in these parts, owning local estates. Looking up the river to Glasgow, we can see Cartsdyke or Crawfordsdyke Harbour on our right. Originally separate from Greenock, Crawfordsdyke was the property of Christian Crawford and her husband Thomas McKnight, who are the lairds of that area. Thomas returned from North Carolina after the Revolution, where he owned the large Belleville estate. He had been a partner of James Parker. The Parkers, who live in Fairley, are involved with the West Indies Company of Sandbach Tin and have marriage connections with the Raineys. McEnroy, who owns an estate at Lunderson, living at Levan House, is also a partner. Dellingburn, also on our right, is the estate belonging to Mungo Nutter Campbell, 6 years my junior, who was recently Provost of Glasgow. His father was the Inspector of Customs at Port Glasgow. He inherited 5 plantations in Guyana. And beyond that, our rival town, Port Glasgow. Greenock expanded in order to compete with Port Glasgow and take away its trade, because of its better facilities. As a result, it has attracted more investment and is growing by the day. Sir Michael Shaw Stewart, our Member of Parliament, himself a plantation owner, married Eliza Farquhar, who is heir to the estates of her father Robert, and has the New Ark estate in Port Glasgow. She apparently owns 800 slaves. Robert Farquhar is the son of Elizabeth Harvey of Castle Semple. So many of these local West Indies merchants are related in some way and are a powerful lobby in Parliament. I have just stepped off the Postboy, a steamboat plying between Glasgow and Greenock. This new technology allows us to ignore the tides and takes advantage of the deepening Clyde. We have to thank the ingenuity of Clyde shipbuilders and engineers. It's a new era. Let us go over to the Custom House. In front of us is the magnificent Custom House, which was built in 1818. The trade of the port had increased so rapidly that in 1815 the premises occupied by the Customs, where I worked in 1796, were found to be totally inadequate to the accommodation of the officers of the revenue, in consequence of which a new Custom House was begun and has lately been finished. It faces the river and the quay and is a very splendid edifice. The Custom House enters from the front towards the river by a very handsome projectile of the Grecian or Doric order, in which style the building is designed, and the excise, on the east end, by a corresponding colonnade of 3/4 columns. The interior arrangements are very extensive and complete, and the staircases, from their extent, afford immediate access to all the offices. Unless it can be explained as an uncaptivating companion endured, I know not why Greenock has taken possession of so cosy a nook in my affection. For although I do regard with a kind of fraternal attachment the companion of my youth, I am as ignorant of the cause. But if my friends in the magistracy of Greenock were sympathetic entities, they would direct their treasury to repay me for the boat hire it cost me, while at Quebec, for going across the St. Lawrence by myself, merely to see a fine view from below Point Levi, which I thought marvellously like that from the Custom House quay of Greenock. I wrote about smuggling in my Annals of the Parish. It was in this year, 1761, the Reverend Micah Balwhidder is saying that the great smuggling trade corrupted all the west coast. The tea was going like the chaff, and the wastrel of all things was terrible. There was nothing minded but the riding of cadgers by day and excise men by night, and battles between the smugglers and the king's men both by sea and land. There was a continual drunkenness and debauchery, and our session that was but on the lip of this whirlpool of iniquity had an awful time of it. I did all that was in the power of nature to keep my people free from the contagion. I preached 16 times from the text, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. I visited, exhorted, I warned, and I prophesied. I told them that although money came in like slate stones, it would go like snow off the dike, but for all I could do, the evil got in amongst us. Some time afterwards he tells how he was invited to tea with a Mrs. Malcolm, one of his parishioners, where he lost some of his dislike to the tea, and we had it then, he confesses, for our breakfast in the morning at the manse, as well as in the afternoon. But it did no harm to the head of drinkers, which was not always the case with the possets that were in fashion before. So both for its temperance and on account of Mrs. Malcolm's sale, I refrained from the November in this year to preach against tea. But, he goes on, I never lifted the weight of my displeasure from off the smuggling trade. The Custom House has dealt with the issues of smuggling since the very beginning, as avoidance of taxation is seemingly the number one pursuit. Battles between the exciseman and smugglers or their customers were at their fiercest when the cargo consisted of food and the mob were hungry. At Greenock there were riots when ships brought in food from Ireland in 1770. A most violent and outrageous mob has risen at Greenock and by force broken open the hatches and carried away the sails of the vessels laying in that harbour laden with oatmeal, and taken and carried away all the said meal, despite of whatever could be done to prevent it. The complement of 20 dragoons could hardly control the mob of 5,000. A magistrate who tried to intervene would have been thrown over the quay had he not been caught and dragged into the custom house. Let us head into the town. If we go over to the quay and walk towards the old harbour, I recount from my book The Steamboat. When we came to the town of Greenock, I was much surprised to see it, a place of great extent and traffic, of which I had no notion. More especially was I struck with wonder at the custom house. That is a most stately erection, for in Greenock there is not only a steeple, but likewise a bottle cone and a bell entry. And not only an old harbour, but also a new harbour. Besides the place they call the Tail of the Bank, with divers churches, schools, and places of worship, a tontine inn, a playhouse, and assembly rooms, built at a great cost of thousands of pounds, for the purpose of having a dance, maybe thrice a year. I'll certainly not go the length of the Port Glasgow man that came upon us on the road, and say that the tontine is a monument of the upsetting vanity of the Greenock folk, but it's surely a type of the enterprising spirit of the place, for it should be allowed that they must have had great notions of things, and a strong sense of prosperity, to project and bring to a completion such undertakings. I recall the story of old Andrew Tillery, who'd been press-ganged on several occasions, but in every instance he escaped by jumping from the jolly boat intended to convey him and his unfortunate companions to the frigate awaiting them at the anchorage. He was a noted swimmer and diver, and it is reported a common feat of his was to dive from one side of his vessel and come to the surface on the other, so that it is probable he easily eluded his would-be captors, who would rather in the darkness, for it was usually night-time when the kidnapped men were taken on board, lose one man than risk the loss of all. In this connection, a story is told of how Andrew dealt with a niggardly passenger from an Irish steamer on its arrival at the Custom House quay. The gentleman, coming ashore on an unsteady plank, took occasion to look at his watch, which had no chain attached, and inadvertently dropped it into the river. Andrew, standing on the quay, observed the accident and, throwing off his coat, dived into the water. He had disappeared for so long a time as to cause considerable anxiety to the bystanders, and his reappearance was greeted with cheers, which were renewed when he held up to view the passenger's watch. Everyone hailed him as a hero, and many offered personal congratulations. The owner of the recovered article was less enthusiastic. "I'm sure I'm much obliged to you," he said to Andrew, at the same time pressing into his still wet palm a small coin. Andrew looked at it. It was not half a sovereign, it was a sixpence. "What's this for?" he demanded. Before the generous passenger had realised what had happened, his watch was whirling through space and into the water which had before engulfed it. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "Now just say what you would give to get back your watch again," replied Andrew, as he walked up the quay. As we walk along the quay, we come to the east breast of the old harbour, a harbour which was built in 1750. Greenock at this time had become the chief port for ships from Virginia and the West Indies, loaded with tobacco, sugar, rum, and cotton, and so close was the connection between it and the colonies, which were then somewhat unhealthy, that it was frequently remarked that there was scarcely a family in town but had some relative, a father, son, brother, or cousin, buried in a Virginian or West Indian grave. This trade continued to increase until the breaking out of the American Revolutionary War, when it was diminished to a considerable extent. Walking along these harbour breasts, I see the harbour full of ships from the West Indies unloading their sugar into the many warehouses. The harbour is never empty, and no matter the hour, no sooner are the ships alongside than discharging begins, and the sampler's box wheeled alongside, and the neatly marked sample papers hung therein on strings to be skilfully and neatly handled by good old John Galbraith or his faithful assistant John Curry, neither of whom, notwithstanding the hurry all round, ever seemed to move a hair or a muscle. The Brazil vessels, which are usually at the wee shed, come in to MacArthur and Binney, or more often to the Newfoundland houses such as Bain and Johnson or J&W Stewart, James Ewing and Co., Demerara Traders, Gregor Turnbull and Co., and John Lamont and Co., with our Trinidad ships. Hastie and Co. and James Richardson Company, who import largely from Mauritius, all furnish their quota to the harbour. Listen to the noise. All around are pubs and lodging houses. People from all over the world mingle here. It is a melting pot of the British Empire, with the various languages and accents. At the mid-quay we walk past the fish market. You can see the mid-parish church across the road at the top of the street. The market is not as busy as it used to be, with most of the river and lochs being overfished, but fishing was the basis of the success on which Greenock was founded. The herring and cod of Scotland and Newfoundland were the main source of protein for the slaves in the West Indies. It was fish rather than sugar that has made Greenock successful to this point, and all the big houses in the surrounding countryside here belong to Newfoundland merchants, mostly Greenock merchants, like Walter Bain, George Robertson, William Forsyth, the Stuarts and such like. When it was proposed to enlarge the harbour of Greenock, I had the scheme of a genius to submit. I wrote, "There is a large sandbank, often dry at low water. It occurred to me that this bank might be converted into land, and I have still a cheap and feasible plan to do it. But unfortunately, the bank belonged to the Crown and was too sacred to be improved." It may be added that the sandbank was gifted to the town by Crown Charter on the 30th of September 1816. My schemes are of too grand a fabric to obtain any attention. No one is capable of appreciating their importance. As we walk up the mid-quay towards William Street, which was once known as Alexander Street from 1750 to 1775, we see on the right the offices of the Greenock Advertiser. I wrote articles and poetry for the editor, John Davidson, but I had a falling out with him over the merits of Thomas Campbell's Battle of Hohenlinden, which he thought unworthy of his paper. The Advertiser is now owned by Menons, whose father is the editor of the Glasgow Herald. Oh, and by the way, Matilda Sinclair of Greenock married Thomas Campbell. The Sinclair brothers were West India merchants who went bankrupt in 1795. Also here is the James Watt Tavern. built on the site of the birthplace of James Watt, and the shop of the McPhees, who are grocers and sugar refiners. Robert, the son, married my sister Agnes. The first coffee room was here too, where all the matters of the day were discussed. Bailey Martin, the ship owner and one of Greenock's best citizens, has his office here. It was he who asked Laird Forrest, when he was building the big house in Cathcart Square, how high he was going to make it, and when he replied, "Up to heaven," the good old man said, "I want to live in the top flat." We shall walk up to the square in front of the kirk. Cathcart Square has been from time immemorial the historical centre of the town. The active and busy generations, now no more, have often demonstrated within its precincts, giving expression of their approval or disapproval of the men and measures of the time. The fairs of the olden time were exclusively held within its area, and here the showmen of the past harangued the crowd on the cheapness and the excellence of their tinsel wares. Here, twice a year, assembled from the surrounding districts, farmers and their wives, and the agricultural servants, the former in quest of men and maids, and the latter on the lookout for masters and mistresses, the result being a motley crowd and a curious huckstering as to fees, accompanied by extraordinary scenes of jollity and mirth. The mid or New Kirk's foundation stone was laid on the 5th and 6th of April 1759. The design was based on St. Martin in the Fields in London. There is almost an exact copy of this, built in wood, in New Brunswick, Canada, built by Christopher Scott. Joiner work from the mid-kirk was done by the father of James Watt, and if you look at the steeple, you will see what is called the Gilded Gabbert. It represents the fishing success of the town. It is also the subject of some mirth between ourselves and Port Glasgow, a galleon in full sail, but I will talk about this later. Inside the kirk is a memorial to my very good friend William Spence, who sadly died in 1815, aged just 38. We spent many an hour together writing, composing music and discussing all manner of topics. I wrote the inscription, and I also presented his collection of books to the Watt Library on behalf of his wife. Nominations for the first parliamentary election were made from hustings erected under the porch of the mid-palace, where the respective candidates held forth to the delectations of a crowded square. The parliamentary elections first held in 1832, following the Reform Act. The White Hart Inn was founded in 1770 and was the oldest family and commercial hotel in Greenock. It was a popular place for council meetings and other community occasions. Thomas Bunton, the proprietor, died at the White Hart Inn in Greenock on the 1st of January 1843, aged 62. Nearly opposite is situated the exchange, finished in 1814 at an expense of £7,000. This spacious erection, though rather confined to give it full effect, is a great ornament to the street. It contains 2 assembly rooms, which are fitted up in splendid manner, and when lighted and decorated, and enlivened with a gay assemblage for an evening party, has a brilliant appearance. The first assembly took place in Alexander's Land, William Street, afterwards in the Town Hall, in the Star Hall, the Buck's Head Inn, the Masonics Lodge, and the Tontine. Lane is a large room occupied as the coffee room, which receives a variety of London and provincial papers, besides the periodicals of the day, and works giving information on commercial subjects. The expense is defrayed by an annual subscription of 35 shillings, but strangers are admitted without introduction and are considered as such for 6 weeks' residence in town. The first coffee room was in the low flat of William Alexander's great tenement in William Street, and if then limited in its dimensions, had one great advantage in bringing this a close and friendly reciprocity of sentiment. The present town hall was also used for a considerable time for this purpose, and from thence to its present situation, the coffee room was removed in 1814. The new coffee room at the corner of the square was commenced in 1820 and finished the same year. The reason for this new erection was in consequence of a difference having arisen between a number of the subscribers and the proprietors of the exchange buildings. As the succession was almost immediate, or at least before the new room was built, the members were accommodated in the White Hart Inn. The spirit of discord was intensified also by what is still referred to as the political battle of the Reds, the Tories, and the Blues, Liberals, which arose out of a difference of opinion amongst the members of the reading or coffee room as to who were proprietors and who were not. The town reading room, exchange buildings, had been erected chiefly as an assembly rooms. The majority of the proprietors were Tories. The larger body of subscribers, on the other hand, were Liberals, and consequently had the greater say in the management. Owing to the influx of radical opinion, the proprietors took occasion to insist upon the exclusion of what they regarded as objectionable newspapers. This led to the resignation of 263 subscribers, who left in a body and established themselves temporarily in the White Hart Hotel, and subsequently built the coffee room in Cathcart Square. The magistrates came to be identified with his seating numbers, their opponents with those who remained. Almost every inhabitant was a party to the dispute. Hundreds of pounds were spent in litigation, and the town set by the ears with dissensions, the effect of which persisted for years after a settlement had been reached. I wrote in the Ayrshire Legatees, by the pen of Miss Rachel Pringle to Miss Molly Glencairn, a pleasantly satirical allusion to this event. The people of this town are a very busy and clever race, but much given to litigation. My brother says that they are the greatest benefactors to the outer house, and that their lawsuits are the most amusing and profitable before the courts, being less for the purpose of determining what is right than what is not. The chambermaid of the inn where we lodge pointed out to me, on the opposite side of the street, a magnificent edifice erected for balls, but the subscribers have resolved not to allow any dancing till it is determined by the Court of Session to whom the seats and chairs belong, as they were brought from another house where the assembly held. I have heard of a lawsuit compared to a country dance, in which after a great bustle and regular confusions, the parties stand still, all tired, just on the spot where they began. But this is the first time that the judges of the land have been called on to decide when a dance may begin. When a dance may begin. In the centre of the square is a horseshoe which marks the spot at which public executions took place. In 1812, Moses MacDonald, a key labourer, was hanged for burglary and theft from the shop of James Jolly, the grocer, in Harvey Lane. In 1817, Bernard McIlvogue, Hugh McIlvogue and Patrick McChrystal were hanged for burglary at the house of Robert Morris, a farmer in Everton. And in 1817, John Kerr, a ship scraper, was executed for wife murder at the open shore. In 1834, John Boyd, also for wife murder, in Harvey Lane. For example, Moses MacDonald's procession to the gallows in Greenock took 4 hours, and involved the criminal as well as officials, including the sheriff, the magistrates, the town council and the local clergy, and was made more stark as the town had not witnessed a similar event in living memory. Instead, they argued that the executions would be detrimental to the local area, and asked for mercy for the community. Following the conviction of Moses MacDonald for housebreaking and theft, he was sentenced to be hanged near the scene of the crime in Greenock. The magistrates of the town sent a petition to London stating their firm conviction that every beneficial consequence to that community, which could be contemplated by the result of a public execution, will be equally, preferably, prompted by a commutation of his punishment from death to transportation. Reports recounting dark and salacious deeds were popular with the public, and like today's sensationalist tabloids, sold in large numbers. Crimes could generate sequences of sheets covering descriptive accounts, court proceedings, last words, lamentations, and executions, as they occurred. As competition was fierce, immediacy was paramount, and these occasions provided an opportunity for printers and patterers to maximise sales. In the centre of the square is a horseshoe which marks the spot at which public executions took place. In 1812, Moses MacDonald, a key labourer, was hanged for burglary and theft from the shop of James Jolly, the grocer, in Harvey Lane. In 1817, Bernard McIlvogue, Hugh McIlvogue and Patrick McChrystal were hanged for burglary at the house of Robert Morris, a farmer in Everton. And in 1817, John Kerr, a ship scraper, was executed for wife murder at the open shore. In 1834, John Boyd, also for wife murder, in Harvey Lane. For example, Moses MacDonald's procession to the gallows in Greenock took 4 hours and involved the criminal and his family as well as officials, including the sheriff, the magistrates, the town council and the local clergy, and was made more stark as the town had not witnessed a similar event in living memory. Instead, they argued that the executions would be detrimental to the local area, and asked for mercy for the community. Following the conviction of Moses MacDonald for housebreaking and theft, he was sentenced to be hanged near the scene of the crime in Greenock. The magistrates of the town sent a petition to London stating their firm conviction that every beneficial consequence to that community, which could be contemplated by the result of a public execution, will be equally, nay preferably, prompted by a commutation of punishment from death to transportation. Reports recounting dark and salacious deeds were popular with the public, and like today's sensationalist tabloids, sold in large numbers. Crimes could generate sequences of sheets covering descriptive accounts, court proceedings, last words, lamentations and executions, as they occurred. As competition was fierce, immediacy was paramount, and these occasions provided an opportunity for printers and patterers to maximise sales. Cathcart Street is the main shopping area and leads down towards the new harbours. Let me recount a tale as we walk along the street about Dr. David Colquhoun. Born in 1743, he died in 1807. He was the brother of Patrick, Glasgow Provost, and Virginia merchant, and father of Dr. John Colquhoun. MacTaggart was fond of horses, and when he finally left school, he got a job as a stable boy at the White Hart Inn. While so employed, he was occasionally called upon to drive old Dr. Colquhoun on his round of visits to patients. The choleric old gentleman, being satisfied with the lad's services, engaged him as a handyman about his house, which was situated on the west side of Cathcart Square, the duties being to attend to the horse and stables, and to do odd jobs in the house, including waiting at table. Few servant girls remained more than 2 or 3 months with Dr. Colquhoun on account of his hot temper, but MacTaggart was in his employment from 1808 until 1811, when the crisis came. The doctor had accepted an invitation to dine with Sir John Shaw Stewart, and in his absence young MacTaggart had asked for and obtained permission from Mrs. Colquhoun to get out for a few hours, on the understanding that he should return before his master. Unfortunately, the latter was home first, and foaming with rage, had to put up the horse himself. When Tag came in, the doctor rushed upon him, cane in hand, and belaboured him heavily. The youth dodged, twisted, and turned, darted from one room to another, around the tables and along the passage, in a vain attempt to reach the front door and gain access to the square. The furious medico following up, and managing every now and then to inflict a stinging blow with a cane. At length the victim, doubling, deftly eluded his pursuer, got out at the back door, reached the stable, picked up a hay fork and turned, preparing to receive cavalry. The tables were turned. One glance at the lad's pale, set face, his glittering eyes, and the doctor fled. After him went Tag, and as the old gentleman reached his dining-room door, a vigorous prod in the small of his back elicited a yell which almost frightened household into hysterics, for he thought he had been stabbed by the business end of a hay-fork. He managed to shut and lock the door against his pursuer, and feeling his back, was relieved to find that he had not been pierced. Meanwhile MacTaggart was pounding on the outside of the butt end of his implement, which end he had, of course, used on the doctor's back, and demanding instant payment of the wages due to him, for he was determined not to remain an hour longer in such a service. The extraordinary events of the past few minutes brought old Dr. Colquhoun to his senses. He tried to pacify the angry lad, but he was afraid to open the door. He even asked him to forget all that had passed, and remain in his employment, but the youth was obdurate. After further fruitless parleying, the latter said he would leave the house that night, but would return to his money the next day. Accordingly, he came back in the morning, put everything to rights about the stable, and both being now in a reasonable frame of mind, settled up with the doctor. We are passing the commodious inn, now nearly finished, known by the name of the Tontine. Together with the extensive table We are passing the elegant and commodious inn, now nearly finished, known by the name of the Tontine, together with the stables and coach-house attached thereto. Travellers have long complained of the want of proper accommodation in Greenock. The Tontine Inn will in future prevent the possibility of any complaints of this nature, and the possession of it must be an object highly deserving the attention of any experienced person in this line of business, who in an increasing town like Greenock cannot fail to meet the greatest encouragement and success. Applications to be made in writing to the Treasurer, who will lay them before the committee, and a day will be appointed to take the same into consideration and on. By order of the committee, James Leach, Treasurer. The Tontine Inn contains the following accommodations: handsome public rooms, 8 excellent parlours, 22 bedrooms with dressing closets, bar room, and a commodious family apartments, commodious kitchen, servants' apartments, cellars, catacombs, etc. The stables contain stalls for horses, and besides coach house, hay loft and granaries, there are several comfortable dwelling houses for the families of the different servants employed about the house. I need to post a letter at the post office up ahead at Watt Place. A particular friend of mine is deeply interested in Virginia and wishes me to procure for him the price of land in either section of the state. I have, in consequence, applied to my different Virginia acquaintances and thought I should ask them, what is the price of the state land? What is the general price and payment of land? What is the reason that there are fewer Negroes in the western section than in the other two? It is important to keep up my contacts in the New World. The post office has never possessed any building entirely for itself, and consequently the frequent movements from one place to another have been at the suggestion of the postmaster of the day. It has at last settled the opening at the head of Cross Shore Street, named Watt Place. The revenue from this establishment in 1797 was £2,800, and in 1828 the sum of £4,183 was collected. On the right, we shall climb Sir John's Brae to the Well Park. In 1745, the year of the last rebellion, Sir John, who was now well advanced in life and not so able to take the field as in 1715, remained in Greenock and interested himself raising a body of volunteers for the protection of the town and neighbourhood. He drilled them regularly himself in the park, and occasionally rode through the town at their head, the volunteers carrying their baggage and accoutrements as if under marching orders. The Well Park is part of what is called the policies. They are out with the control of the council, and as a result of some lax rules, it has become an area of some squalor. Buildings have been placed higgledy-piggledy upon each other and let out to multiple occupants. Sanitation is very poor, with excrement being thrown onto the street with no provision for clearance. The old mansion of the Shaw-Stewart family stands upon a fine rising ground above the assembly rooms, and commands a most extensive view of the town. This situation, before the buildings encroached upon it, must have been one of delightful retirement and beauty. There must have been various additions built to the house since its first erection. An ancient well close by bears dates upon it 1629. Over one of the entrances to the garden is affixed 1635, but the oldest date in connection with the house is over a back entrance, 1637. The front and greater part of the building is of modern erection and is said to have been planned by James Watt. It was here, however, that baronial hospitality spread the board, and from this place John Shaw, with about 200 of his tenantry, marched to the assistance of King Charles II, and fought with that prince at the Battle of Worcester, on the 3rd of September 1631. The banner which was carried on this occasion was preserved till about 1796, and hung along with town flags in the coffee room, but since this period was never seen. A very imperfect idea now can be formed of the beauty and extent of this baronial policy. Mr. Alexander Drummond, His Majesty's Consul at Tripoli, takes notice of this place when speaking of Vabro in Italy. Here the Count de Mercy possesses a beautiful house that stands upon the top of the hill, with fine terrace gardens sloping down to the riverside, which yield a delicious prospect to the eye. Yet beautiful as this situation is, the house of Greenock would have been infinitely more noble, had it been according to the original plan, above the terrace, with a street opening down to the harbour. Indeed, in that case, it would have been the most lordly sight in Europe. This is all due to the laird moving to the estate of Irvine, where Mansion House used to have large gardens, fruit trees and ponds. Trade and business have encroached gradually, taking over the land with stores, tanneries, joineries and so on. The house is now sublet to many families.